one of the first things you have committed to memory when you start studying for the New York City Sightseeing Guides exam is that New York street grid was laid out in the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. But one of the things you don't have to know is who these commissioners were, which I think is a shame because one of these guys, he needs a miniseries. He needs movies, he needs books written about him. But we're not going to start with him. We're going to start with one of his fellow commissioners, who was also his half-nephew-in-law. Convoluted, but his name was John Rutherford. The main things to know is his political background as a early U.S. senator for New Jersey. He was also New Jersey's largest landowner when he died in 1840, and that Rutherford, New Jersey is partially named for him and partially named for President Rutherford B. Hayes. So John Rutherford is probably the least interesting commissioner, and according to his half-uncle-in-law's notes, he did the least work on the commission, so we're just gonna toss him aside. So moving on to the second most interesting guy on the commission, and probably the most qualified guy in the room, Simeon DeWitt, first cousin to DeWitt Clinton, who was one time New York City mayor, New York City governor, and a big proponent of the Erie Canal. So Simeon DeWitt, his cousin, had a nearly 60-year career in land surveying by the time he died in 1834. But at the time of the commission, he was New York State's Surveyor General. But he doesn't do any surveying for this commission. He actually chooses one of his proteges, 20-year-old John Randall Jr., to be the chief surveyor of the commission. Yes, I said 20-year-old John Randall Jr. Having a 20-year-old in this position of chief surveyor for Manhattan Island, that's wild. And John Randall Jr. probably had the second most interesting life out of all the people involved with the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. But we're going to ignore him. We're going to ignore him completely because I want to talk about Gouverneur Morris. First of all, what is the consensus of this guy's name's pronunciation? I've heard Gouverneur Morris. I've heard Gouverneur Morris. I'm going to go with Gouverneur Morris because that's safe. But speaking of his name, if you're from the Bronx, you're probably familiar with his last name, Morris, because of the Morris Heights, the Morris Heights. You're probably familiar with Morris Heights, Morrisania, Port Morris, Morris Park. So Gouverneur Morris is from that same family that owned a huge chunk of what's now the Bronx. But during the American Revolution, Gouverneur Morris is on the side of the Americans, while his family, they're staunch loyalists, so they kick him out. He becomes BFFs with George Washington, and fast forward to the Constitutional Convention, and my guy, he just would not shut up. He gives 173 speeches, the most out of anyone there at the convention. And some of those speeches are condemning slavery and exposing the hypocrisy of slave states denying the humanity of the enslaved while wanting to include them in the population count in order to increase the state's political power. So you know they wanted to put that guy on mute. But they end up tasking him with writing out the final language of the Constitution. And he's specifically credited with the Constitution's preamble reading, "We the people," implying that we're one nation instead of a collection of states in alliance. So that's cool, that's important, but that's not the main reason, that's not the main thing people remember Gouverneur Morris for. What sticks with you is the salaciousness of his personal life. Let me sum it up this way. If Gouverneur Morris had a Spotify account in 2025, his top song would be Pretty Girls by Will Smith. Because this dude, he was supposedly 6'4" and handsome and witty. And that combination got him into a lot of ladies' beds and into a lot of trouble. So 200-year-old rumor has it that Morris, whose left leg was amputated when he was 28, lost that leg while running from an angry husband whose wife he had charmed. The official story is that he lost his leg in a carriage accident, but the other story is more fun. But when it comes to the way Gouverneur Morris died, the truth is stranger than fiction. So our main man Morris died from died from died from sticking a whalebone up his dick. I'm not gonna elaborate. Just maybe that's why we don't talk about who the commissioners behind New York's grid plan are. Maybe that, and the fact that the commissioners didn't really put in that much work into creating the plan. They heavily based it off of a grid previously designed by a surveyor named Kashmir Gorak. But I think it's probably the first reason, because why would he do